If you want to start a spirited debate at your next holiday meal, ask your guests which country invented wine. France, Italy, or Greece might come to mind. But most scholars say Georgia, the small former Soviet republic, is the birthplace of wine. Scientists say wine residue found on pieces of pottery in Georgia dates back 8,000 years. The country, of nearly 4 million, shares a border with Russia and has survived thousands of years of invasions and wars. Multiple dynasties have come and gone, but somehow many Georgian grapes survived. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through Georgia to meet the promoters and protectors of Georgia's ancient vines.
The story will continue in a moment.
When you first set foot in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, she's hard to miss. Perched high up over the city, the towering mother of Georgia wields a sword in her right hand to fend off her enemies and a bowl of wine in her left to welcome friends. That welcome and the country's deep history of winemaking winds through Georgia. The vines of city dwellers cling to tiny balconies. Small family vineyards stretch along the countryside. And larger producers export millions of bottles globally. But to fully understand the rich history of wine in Georgia, we went to the fertile river valley of Kakheti to see the Aloi Monastery. At the foot of the Caucasus Mountains, the monastery looks like a fortress. We were invited inside its walls. Our host was Georgian Orthodox Bishop David. He oversees 3 monks who live on the grounds of the medieval compound. It is a quiet life, committed to God and the godly pursuit of creating a perfect glass of wine.
How many bottles of wine do you make here a year?
20,000 bottles with a maximum of 50,000 bottles. Our wine cellar's capacity is 30 tons of wine.
4 monks, 20,000 bottles. This is a lot of work. Do they ever sleep?
We sleep and work at the same time.
Locals help work the land. But for centuries, the monks have been the guardians of these ancient vines. The monastery dates back to the 6th century. Bishop David told us vines were planted on day 1.
Does making wine make you feel closer to God?
Of course, whenever we are in the vineyard or the wine cellar, we always feel that God is close to us.
Grapes have long held a sacred place in Georgia. In ancient times, wine was considered a divine drink and offered to the gods to win favor. Georgian soldiers tied a piece of grapevine inside the chest of their uniforms to protect them and to assure that if they died in battle, a vine would sprout from their heart. Man was mortal, but Georgian vines eternal. For centuries, the Georgian monks have made wine the same way, producing reds, whites, and even ambers. More on that in a moment. The process is uniquely Georgian. Under the monastery, buried 6 feet deep in the ground, giant clay pots called qvevri are used to ferment, store, and age the wine. It is the traditional way to make wine in Georgia. Many homes have qvevris in their cellar. But today, there are only a handful of qvevri makers who carry on the tradition of hand-building these clay beasts. Some hold nearly 900 gallons of wine. Pressed grapes, skins, stalks, and the juice are all mixed into the qvevri, which is buried in the ground to maintain a constant temperature. Every day during the harvest, the monks make their way through the hallowed halls of the monastery to bless the wine cellar, the grapes, and toast the bounty their vineyards bring. Most of the monks' wine is sold. Some is shared during Sunday communion inside the Aloi Cathedral. On this day, a haunting chant stirred inside the cathedral dome. The chant, called "You Are the Vineyard," was written 900 years ago by a former king turned monk to honor Georgia's deep connection to its religion and wine. Lit by candles, it's hard to see the scars of the cathedral. It survived earthquakes and invasions. In an attempt to erase Georgian culture, Russians whitewashed the cathedral interiors in the 20th century, covering up 11th century frescoes, and used the monastery's qvevris to store their gasoline. But miraculously, many of the vines were unharmed. Bishop David says today, 100 grape varieties, some dating back 900 years, are still grown on the monastery's grounds.
And how does the wine taste?
Not to talk about taste, it's better to taste it ourselves.
Sitting near the ancient qvevris, the bishop opened a bottle.
When tasting the qvevri wine for the first time, a person might think they are trying something very different.
Ooh, it does look golden. Amber. Look at that color.
And they say in Georgia that the eye drinks and the eye eats. That's what we have to thankful to God.
There's much to be thankful to God about in this glass.
Of course, it could not be any other way.
Heavenly, with notes of citrus, spices, and honey. It is complex, like the history of Georgia, but in a glass. Georgia's future is also tied to its wines, inspiring chefs like Takuna Gachichi Lodze.
How much is wine a part of the story of this country?
This is, the question, wine or food or wine, It's so together because we don't imagine our everyday life without the wine. And the wine, it's one of the most important part in our history and our culture and in food also.
49-year-old Takuna wasn't supposed to be a chef. While pursuing a psychology degree in New York, she was working at a restaurant and fell in love with both the chef and cooking. She dropped the psych degree and the chef and enrolled in culinary school in Manhattan. A master chef, Takuna is now known as the godmother of Georgia's culinary evolution. She runs the popular Cafe La Terra in the capital of Tbilisi, a restaurant known for its adventuresome menu and wine pairings.
You're credited with revolutionizing Georgian cuisine. How have Georgians responded to that?
I just started to experiment, and then I started to do new recipes based on the traditional ones, and then give this choice, to people. And in the beginning, it was big resistance. The people think you have to keep tradition and untouched. But for me, tradition is always innovation, because every dish was somehow innovative when it started.
Georgia sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. A Georgian dinner can look and taste like a trip around the world.
All these influences, starting from China, even from America to Europe, it's gathered here. It was a hub. And that's why our cuisine, traditional cuisine, it was always fusion. So
Georgia was fusion before fusion was fusion.
Exactly. And also because so many invasions, and we were always under the rule of different countries. And this brought these different tastes and the spices and also cooking methods. This is all yours.
Oh, gosh. Perfect.
Culinary clashes are my favorite kind of conflicts to cover. I reported for duty at the dinner table.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Yes, it's beautiful.
This is our first dish, like an appetizer. It's called pchalis, the vegetables with walnuts. We cook in Georgia lots with the walnuts.
Walnuts are one of the workhorses of Georgian cuisine, pulverized and used the same way the French use butter, to make everything creamier. Not surprisingly, grape leaves are also a favorite ingredient.
This is tolma, and you can't imagine any table without this dish.
Our dinner included 5 courses with 6 dishes, each with a different glass of wine.
We have this like a filet mignon.
Do you have a couch that I can recline on?
Yes.
Chef Takuna insisted we taste everything because the wines came from different regions and each had its own unique flavor.
We have so many great winemakers, and it is like a new revolution, and not losing the old traditions. They improve it and then continue doing the great wines.
But there is no wine more distinctly Georgian than this.
You see the difference
Look at
of
the
the
color of
colors?
this.
Yeah. That's why it's called amber.
Not orange.
Yeah, no.
Not orange.
Never orange.
No.
Americans know what to do with red wine, we know what to do with white wine, but if you put an amber wine out, I would not know what I should be serving that with.
Actually, this is what's very interesting. Amber wine, it's like a universal wine. You can drink with the vegetables, you can drink with meat, but this is what makes it unique, You can pair almost with everything.
It's versatile. So I noticed you said you don't like to eat when you're cooking, but you will have a sip, right?
But I drink.
Fine, then you can stay.
2 hours later, the warmth of Georgian hospitality, or perhaps all that wine, washed over us.
It's like a Georgian saying that the guests are from the gods. So you have to treat the guest like you treat the gods.
We usually hear about guests from hell, but guests from the gods sounds a lot better.
In Georgia, we got guests are really from the gods. Cheers.
When we come back, you'll meet a guest who came to Georgia for the culture, food, and wine 25 years ago and never left. Today, he's credited with helping to put Georgian wines on the map and menus around the world. When most of us order wine, we look for a favorite variety, consider the region, the age, or perhaps the cost. But ordering a glass of wine from Georgia can be a bit more complicated. The former Soviet bloc nation is the size of West Virginia, but offers more than 40 varieties of wine, each with a tongue-twisting name from vines centuries old. Still, Georgian wine is gaining popularity beyond the country's borders. Last year, nearly 1.5 million bottles of it were shipped to the United States, an increase of nearly 30% from the previous year. We headed to Georgia's wine country to get a taste for ourselves.
The story will continue in a moment.
Stretched along eastern Georgia, more than 4,000 square miles of vineyards sit at the base of its mountains like a welcome mat. This is the Kakheti region. 3/4 of the grapes used to make wine in Georgia are grown here. In the middle of one of Kakheti's hundreds of vineyards, we met an unlikely ambassador of Georgian wine, an American, 47-year-old John Werdeman.
How does an American end up with all of this?
Well, it started with a curiosity for a country that the more I learned about it, the more fascinating it was. And nobody seemed to know anything about it, at least in my world.
Werdeman grew up a world away in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was studying art in Russia when he visited neighboring Georgia. He liked it so much, he moved here, and in 2006 bought a 62-acre rundown vineyard, hired locals, and started Pheasant's Tears Winery. Georgia is the birthplace of wine. The mild climate and rich soil have made it an ideal place to grow hundreds of varieties of grapes for thousands of years. At one time, the country reportedly had more than 1,400 indigenous grape varieties. Most were wiped out during the Soviet era, when quantity replaced diversity. John Werdeman is part of a national effort to recultivate Georgia's ancient vines and bring them back to life.
So in Soviet times, out of 525 varieties, you had roughly 4 or 5 that were the main ones that were commercially available.
So what happened to the rest?
Luckily, Georgians were still growing them in their backyard. They were allowed to have small private plots for their own personal use, and they kept the ancestral varieties going. So when we wanted to start to bring back these ancient varieties together with our friends, that was where we were going. We were going to the individual backyards of farmers that kept growing the varieties that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had kept alive.
Clawing back all of the grape varieties is something Georgians take seriously, a kind of declaration of independence from their former Soviet rulers. In 2014, the Georgian government opened 2 research centers to locate, study, and grow those rare grape vines. Scientists head into the vineyards once a week to gather critical data. DNA of grape leaves is analyzed. Juice is extracted in the field and then tested in labs for disease. Healthy vines are replanted. Today, there are more than 500 native grape varieties growing in Georgia. At Pheasant's Tears, ancient Georgian methods are used to make the wine. Stems, skins, and juice are all mixed together, then poured in giant qvevris buried deep underground and sealed with clay, where the mixture ferments and ages.
This is our lower qvevri level.
Is all the wine here made in qvevris?
Most all of it. There's a couple of wines we'll be tasting later that are on the fresher, lighter side from Western Georgia that we use stainless steel, but everything of structure.
So based on where they are, they have a different taste?
Yeah, if they're in a space that breathes versus a reductive space.
The wine typically remains inside the qvevris for 9 months.
This is where we age the wines.
Then it's bottled and stored in a cellar.
So when are these bottles from?
These are from the last 15 years, but it allows us to understand how the wines develop and what is the most ideal time and for releasing.
Nothing is rushed in Georgia, something we witnessed during lunchtime at the vineyard.
For the harvest of 2023, may it be healthy and long living.
Workers were celebrating the harvest with a traditional Georgian feast called a supra, a lavish meal typically held after weddings, funerals, baptisms, and births. During our lunch, guests broke into song. This is a traditional Georgian folk song, centuries old. A few guests started dancing. Lunch hour stretched into dinner. And then came the toasts.
For children, and for the children that are continuing the tradition.
A half dozen of them before dessert.
With so many toasts, so many songs and dancing, it's amazing anybody eats.
Yeah, but the supras last for quite a long time. If workers go out to work for a few hours in the field and they come back together, they'll have a supra and they'll have toasts about the things that mean the most to them in life. For Georgian winemaking, for the grapes, the history, the vessel, the varieties, and the songs that were built around the feast. Some people have called the Georgian supra an academy, where basically people come together in order to share what they know and to learn from one another.
But John Werdeman says schooling the rest of the world on Georgian wines hasn't been so easy. First, there are at least 40 varieties of Georgian wines being served around the world, and even the most sophisticated sommelier might struggle to just pronounce them. Saparavi, Casatelli, and Mitzvani don't exactly roll off the tongue. Then there's the issue of that unusual color, the giant ginger elephant in the glass.
I've noticed a couple people we've spoken to here, when you say orange wine, they shudder a little bit and say, it's amber. Is there any difference?
No, in terms of modern wine syntax, they're synonyms. But I was also a little bit part of the early conversations where when we were talking about orange wine from Georgia, people were worried, is this some sort of citrus concoction being sold outside of Atlanta?
What is it that creates that beautiful color?
So you're basically leaving the must or the juice of the grapes with skins, the pips, and sometimes the stems. Basically extracting both pigment as well as phenolic structure from the skins. So that's changing the flavor as well as the color. But it's also, a lot of our preconceptions can affect how we perceive the wine. Because if you were to show them that same wine in a black glass, they might say, what a delightfully refreshing light red. But when they see it from a white grape, they think, is this somehow a bit clumsy or rustic or why? You know, this doesn't taste like my Sauvignon Blanc that I'm used to drinking.
A little frustrating.
A friend of mine who's a master of wine in London has a beautiful saying that she gave at a conference once. She said, the orange or amber wines of Georgia are not the mean sisters of whites, but the introspective cousins of reds.
But over the last decade, the Georgian family of wines, reds, whites, and even ambers, have been embraced around the globe. Last year, Georgia exported over 140 million bottles of wine to more than 65 countries.
What do you attribute to that kind of growth?
I think in the very beginning, we were walking around with maps and photographs and saying that, no, we're not, swarthy versions of Russians, but Georgians have their own language, their own wine culture, their own culinary culture, history that is very ancient, and, try the wines, but it took a fair amount of effort to get people to give us the benefit of the doubt and even to try.
Over the past decade, more than 2,000 new vineyards have taken root in the country. And last year, Georgian winemakers made more than $100 million.
All of a sudden, it's like watching a black and white picture of a rainbow come to color again. This diversity and expanse of color is coming back to the Georgian table after sleeping for almost a few centuries.
For Georgians, it's another reason to celebrate. For the rest of the world, it's a chance to taste history.